The first thing that we're going to be learning in lesson 2 is our first ever conjugation in Japanese, which is called te form. Before we learn about what te form is and how to make it, I think it's good to go over what a conjugation is. Conjugations do exist in English, but normally native English speakers don't think about conjugations because we don't need to. We've learned these very naturally, and we use them naturally as well without thinking about what they are and how they work. Conjugations are when we take a word and we change it slightly that keeps the main meaning of the word by slightly changing the meaning. For example, we have the word eat in English. If we conjugate it, we can conjugate it into ate. It's the same word, eat and ate, but ate is the past tense conjugation of eat. If you were to open up a dictionary and look for the word ate, you probably wouldn't find it. It would be under the word eat because it is the word eat, it's just changed into past tense. That's an example of a conjugation. Te form is also a conjugation, which takes a word and slightly changes the meaning. In the case of te form and verbs, when we have a te form conjugation, the main meaning is going to be command form. And that's what we're going to be looking at. So let's get into it and see how these conjugations are made. So, first off, te form is what I refer to as a base conjugation, and that's why we're learning te form first. When I say base conjugation, what that means is that te form is used in lots of different ways. I just mentioned that the first way that we're going to be using te form is te form on its own, which is command form, when you're telling somebody to do something. But there's lots of different ways of using te form by adding on to it. For example, the next thing that we'll be learning is present tense, which is te iru. But for now, let's just focus on te form on its own. And look at an example of that. We know that taberu is to eat. If we make it into te form, it sounds like tabete, which again is a command when you're telling somebody to eat. It's very common to use kudasai after te form command in order to make it more polite by saying please. Tabete kudasai is what that might sound like. There is a bunch of rules for how to make te form that can get a little bit confusing, but the main thing to know is that we're going to be looking at the last character in our verb in order to determine how it's going to conjugate. We have 9 different verb endings, for example, ru or u or gu, and these different endings will conjugate in different ways. And let's go ahead and look at those now. There is a link to it right here, just a little chart that we can use to tell us what those different rules are for te form. And it looks a little bit like this. We're actually going to skip the top here because there's something that's a little bit confusing in it. And we'll start with mu, bu, and nu. So these 3 verb endings all conjugate the same way. They all go to nde. So what that means is that any verb that ends with mu, bu, or nu, in order to make it into te form, we're going to take that character off of the word and add on nde. So for example, if we want to use the word nomu, is a pretty good example. We'll look at that right here. Zoom in just a little bit. Make it nice and big too. So nomu, again, ends with a mu. And by changing it into te form, we look here and nde is our ender. So we're gonna take off the mu and we just have no, and then we'll go to nde. So the te form of nomu is nonde. Of course, it is called te form because most of the endings are te, but some of them do end with de instead. So that's something to be a little bit careful for. And again, any verb that ends with mu, bu, or nu, they all change to nde. So we had nomu, nonde. Yomu would also be yonde. Asobu, to play, goes to asonde. Or shinu, to die, goes to shinde. something that you wouldn't really want to use very often, because again, these are commands when we change them into te form. Looking at the next one, we've got ku as an ender. And one example for that would be kiku. We know that kiku means to listen. So if you wanted to tell somebody to listen by going into te form, we're going to take off that ku and replace it with ite. It helps a little bit to see that one, because that one can be a little bit confusing. Again, kiku looks like that, and we take off that ku, add an extra e, and then put on te. So kiku becomes ki-ite, and this extra e is very important. If you were to forget this e and just put on the te, now it's kite, which is a different word. So this extra e is very important. You should be able to hear it in pronunciation. It should be kite instead of kite. But also when typing it, if you forgot that extra e, it would go to the wrong kanji. We need to add in that extra e to go to our correct kanji in that case. Any verb that ends with gu will go to ide. That one can be a little bit difficult because there aren't very many verbs that end with gu. The main one that we know is oyogu, to swim. So oyogu goes to oyoide. The way that I like to remember gu verbs is ku and gu, of course, are very similar. The only difference is that ku modifies into gu, and the same way we have the conjugation also is the modified version, that te getting changed into de. So it's good to kind of put those together in your head. Ku verbs and gu verbs are very similar for their conjugation. Next up, we're going to look at su verbs like hanasu. The su comes off and we go to shite. So hanasu becomes hanashite. At the bottom of this list here, we do have some irregulars. That's why they're in red, is because they are irregular. They don't follow the rules. Suru is an example. Suru will almost always conjugate its own way. It does what it wants. It's a little bit tricky in that regard. Suru, the entire word just changes into shite for te form. So if you wanted to tell somebody to study, we know study is benkyou suru, and as a command it would be benkyou shite, because the entire suru changes into shite. Another irregular is iku. Iku means to go, and it ends with a ku. We just learned that ku words go to ite. So you would expect the word to look something like this. You would expect iku to go into ite, but it doesn't, because it would be very difficult to say ite, and iku is a very common word. So for pronunciation purposes, to make things easier, instead of being ite, it will instead be ite with a small tsu. So that's a good one to remember because it is quite common. We will now go back up to the top and go over this last thing that is a little bit hard. You, of course, notice that there are ru verbs on here twice. There's this one here, and there's this one here with this little asterisk. The reason why it's on here twice is because any verb that ends with ru conjugates one of two ways, which is different from the other ones. Again, any verb that ends with nu will go to unde. Any verb that ends with ku goes to ite, except for our exception of iku. But ru verbs, depending on the word, will conjugate one of two ways. It'll either conjugate this way, the ru verb way, or this way, kind of the secondary u verb way. Using the first one as an example, these are usually the easier ones. A word like taberu goes to tabete with no small tsu because it conjugates this way. A verb like kairu, which means to go home, conjugates this way, which is kaite with a small tsu. Of course, that is very confusing and very difficult. The first question you should be asking is, wait, how do I know which way it conjugates when I have a verb that ends with ru? The unfortunate answer is you kind of just have to know. At the end of the day, it is just a memorization thing. There is kind of rules like, oh, if the character before the ru is this vowel sound, then maybe it goes this way, but there's exceptions to that as well. So the way that I learned it and the way that I suggest people learn it is just to use these words, practice them, and over time you'll memorize which way these verbs conjugate. It's also good to be aware of the way that we refer to these two different groups, and that is listed up here. There's verbs that conjugate like ru verbs, which are called ichidan, if you want to use the Japanese wording for that. And those are the words that don't have a small tsu in te form. Again, there's kind of two ways of talking about it. When I was in my Japanese class in college, my Japanese teacher called them ru verbs. So my Japanese teacher would say, taberu is a ru verb. Again, ichidan is referring to the same thing. So if you would prefer to call them ichidan words, then that works as well. The second group is called u verbs or godan. So kaeru, as I mentioned, would be an example of an u verb for conjugation, or you could call it a godan verb as well. They both refer to the same thing. They are both used, so whichever one is better for you. Of course, ru verb and u verb is a little bit of an easier way of referring to them, but it can get confusing because like calling kaeru an u verb, for conjugation purposes it is, but it very clearly ends with a ru, so you want to think that it's a ru verb, can get a little bit confusing. Ichidan godan is much clearer as far as explanation goes, as long as you're able to remember which one is which. But again, the main point here is that any verb that ends with ru can conjugate one of two ways. Ichidan verbs don't have a small tsu for te form, and godan verbs do have a small tsu in te form. Very confusing. That will also carry over to every other conjugation that we do in Japanese, so that one's not just for te form. And kind of the good news is that in other conjugation forms, the differences between ichidan and godan verbs is a little bit clearer. In this case, it's kind of subtle. We just have that small tsu or not. But for formal form, for example, I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with formal form. And in formal form, it's the difference between having a ri or not. Taberu is an ichidan verb and goes to tabemasu. Kaeru, being a godan, goes to kaerimasu. So having that extra ri in there means that the verb is a godan verb. Helps a little bit for remembering if you're familiar with formal form. If not, it's fine just to make mistakes and learn the differences between the two by experiencing them a lot and practicing a lot, and eventually you'll get there. And again, it does get easier once we learn formal form. Just to go over the rest of these, verbs that end with u and tsu also conjugate this same way with a small tsu te. So kau goes to katte, or matsu goes to matte. I really like that one because matsu as a verb to wait is very commonly seen in command form. It's very common to tell people, hey, wait, matte, matte. And if you can remember that matsu goes to matte, then you are very easily able to know that any verb that ends with tsu will follow those same rules. And it kind of lets you know that that rule set works for all verbs that end with tsu. And that is something that I suggest you do with all of these verb endings, is kind of choose one verb that you can really hook on to as far as conjugation rules go. Gu, again, is another good example. Oyogu goes to oyoide. If you very clearly remember that oyogu becomes oyoide, then anytime you see a verb that ends with gu, you'll know the te form conjugation rules are ide. Again, it's a little bit difficult because there's lots of memorization involved. And because there's lots of memorization involved, the best way to learn it is with lots of practice. There are practice problems down here. And there's also this website here that I like to show off called Stephencraft. We'll click on this link just to give it a look. Stephencraft is great. It has lots of different conjugation practice materials. If we click on Tayform here, we see that it gives us a randomly generated Japanese word. And maybe you know what this word means, maybe you don't, but regardless, you should be able to know how to change it into Tayform. Here we see that it is the word suwaru that it gave us is an u verb, which is goldon. So that means our Tayform is suwatte with a small 2. We can press enter. It'll tell us that we got it right. And we can press enter and it gives us another word. Hakobu becomes hakonde. Hakonde. There we go. And so just by spending 10-15 minutes on this website doing your Tayform practice while looking at this sheet, if you need to, it does a lot for helping you to remember Tayform, because it is, at the end of the day, just memorization. But the sooner you know Tayform, the better, because we will be using it a lot in the future. Hope you enjoyed. Hopefully it wasn't too confusing. The good news is from here on, things do get a fair bit easier now that we've had this first conjugation out of the way. Good luck and keep on practicing.